Okay. All right, everybody. We'll get it started. Thank you, as always, for those of you who are in person. I see we have a lot of people online as well. I oftentimes say this, we have a very special guest today, Dr. Hotez. Really wonderful to have you. And I think all of us have been following you for years. So thank you for everything you do. Before I introduce or ask Dr. Berry to introduce, I just have a couple quick updates. I'll turn to Steph Harmon.
Thanks, Dr. Ozdalga. Just a few other announcements for this month, celebrating Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander heritage. So we have employee resource groups through our health system, and they host events throughout the year that are open to everyone. And so they wanted me to highlight a few events that are coming up later this month. The first is an art tour of Asian American artists that are featured in 500p in our hospital, which I actually wasn't aware of. And so that's happening on May 24th. And I believe you can register at this link, and we'll make sure that that goes into the chat on the Zoom. And the second event is a celebration at the very end of the month on the 31st at noon at the Promenade in 500p, which will be catered by Burma Love. So register for that and come join us. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Harmon. And then just briefly, next week's Grand Rounds presentation will be honoring the Diversity, Inclusion, Equity Inclusion Awards. We'll have Dr. Tem Woldiesis and Dr. Robert Wong presenting next week. That one will be online only, so please don't come in here in person. So I just want to say a special thank you to Dr. Berry, who has since day one been helping me with amazing Grand Rounds. We've been trying to get Dr. Hotez for years now, and I'm like, how can we get Dr. One day, Dr. Berry just, hey, do you want me to ask Peter Hotez to come? He's a friend. I'm like, oh, perfect. Thank you. And so thanks to her for inviting him and welcoming. And I'll turn over to you for the introductions.
Thanks, Errol. It's absolutely my great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Peter Hotez. Peter is an internationally recognized scientific, pediatrician, and global health physician who has spent his career on the front lines of global health science and advocacy. As a leader in the field of vaccine development, his work is particularly timely. Peter wears many hats, and that's why I have this sheet of paper. He is the Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine and Professor of Pediatrics and Molecular Virology and Microbiology at Baylor College of Medicine, where he's also the co-director of the Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development and Texas Children's Hospital Endowed Chair of Tropical Pediatrics. He leads a team and coordinates partnership of developing new vaccines for coronaviruses, as well as numerous neglected tropical diseases, or what we in the business call NTDs. These include such diseases as hookworm, Chagas disease, schistosomiasis. He and his colleagues were nominated for the Nobel Prize for their development of Corbavax, an inexpensive, affordable COVID-19 vaccine easily accessed by countries around the world. As founding editor-in-chief of PLOS Neglected Tropical Diseases, Peter can really be credited with putting these overlooked diseases on the map and really spearheading really the major elimination of NTDs globally. Besides being this wonderful global tropical medicine doctor, he is the leading voice in public health, and many of you have seen him on CNN and other news agencies. He's a vocal advocate for vaccine access and equity, and has written extensively on the importance of addressing health disparities in the world, as well as in the United States. And through this pandemic, he's really used his skills, his verbal skills, his wit, his sense of humor, to combat misinformation. I'll end by saying he's authored 4 books, including Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism. Rachel happens to be his daughter. And Preventing the Next Pandemic, Vaccine Diplomacy in the Time of Anti-Science. And a little plug, he's writing a new book, which you can pre-order on Amazon, called The Deadly Rise of Anti-Science. Peter, welcome to Stanford, always.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. Love you. So Michelle and I have known each other for 100 years because back when we were on the faculty at Yale, I think I first met you when I was a fellow in pediatric infectious disease. You were in adult medicine. But at the time, I think we were amongst the few global health, physicians interested in global health things, right? So, so finding you was such a treat, and you've been an extraordinary mentor. I don't know whether to call you a mentor or friend. You're a little bit of both, but thank you so much. And it's great to see you. Look terrific, by the way. You all look great. Anybody looks great. I love seeing people in 3 dimensions again. So that's also really nice, and good to meet Dr. Harrington as well. What I'm going to kind of do in this lecture is to kind of give a 30,000-foot aerial view of what I see happening with the vaccine space, and both positive and negative, and from a unique perspective, because I've seen both sides of this, which is that on the left, I did my MD and PhD at Weill Cornell and Rockefeller University in the 1980s, and working to develop vaccines for parasitic diseases, and that's how I got started. And by the way, that vaccine for hookworm that I started as an MD PhD student is now in phase 2 trials, which is about the right time frame, right, for most vaccines, about 40 years. No, it's about right. And at Rockefeller at the time, and to this day, the motto translates from the Latin, knowledge or science for the benefit of humanity. And I truly believed that, and I believe it now. And I thought making vaccines for global health was one of the best expressions of that. And so that part was deliberate in my career. The part that I didn't count on was having to defend vaccines, and never dreaming that there'd be such an aggressive and virulent anti-vaccine movement. And the way I got started was, as Michelle mentioned, I have 4 adult kids, including Rachel, has autism and intellectual disabilities. And I wrote the book. The book, Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, which wound up making me public enemy number 1 or 2 with the anti-vaccine groups. And by that, I actually have had a front row seat to this movement for all the wrong reasons. But it's taught me a lot about disinformation. And now that we have 2 U.S. presidential candidates, well, one declared, one I don't think is declared yet, running on an anti-vaccine platform, that's also gotten very interesting. In fact, one of those publicly labeled me the OG villain, which I'm so old and square, I had to look up what that meant. It meant the original gangster villain. So Dr. Harrington, Dr. Barry, you've invited the original gangster villain to come address you at Stanford. So the talk today is kind of a mixture of both, what we're doing on vaccines and the extraordinary power of vaccines on the one hand, and on the other hand, this very aggressive movement that's countering it. And, the problem is, we call it misinformation or infodemic. And the one message I want to impart to you today is it's none of those things. It's not some random stuff that appears on the internet. This is organized, it's well-financed, and it's politically motivated. I'm working with Dr. Mello and the Lancet Commission on this, and it's become a very powerful force. But we don't talk about it, I think, in a way that helps people to really understand it in a way that I think we should. So I'll talk about that as well. So I'll start out here. Back, after I did my MD PhD, I was a house officer at Mass General, and back then they actually had microscopes in the emergency room, if you could believe it. And the idea was, if you did a lumbar puncture, I did pediatrics at Mass General, you were required to do a gram stain and look at the cerebral spinal fluid under the microscope, and you made the provisional diagnosis. And when you did that, your heart sank if you saw that's in the upper right, which is gram-negative organisms, most likely Haemophilus influenza type B and polymorphonuclear leukocytes, because you knew there was a high likelihood that this child was going to have permanent neurologic injury or deafness, or might not even survive. And while I was a house officer in training, those arrows there point to a series of improvements in the Haemophilus influenza type B vaccine. They took the polyribophosphate capsule of the bacterium, showed it was immunogenic in older kids, but not in infants. But then John Robbins and Rachel Schneerson at the National Institutes of Health figured out if you conjugated it to protein, you haptenize it, it worked in infants. And that was a game changer. So this is a vaccine that was so widely adopted and has such an impact that these are the cases of Haemophilus influenza type B meningitis in the United States. It went from, I was admitting a kid every couple of weeks in my pediatric service with Hib meningitis, to by the time I finished my house officer training, my fellowship, and I was a junior attending and met Michelle, this was a disease we talked about purely for historical interest. It was that powerful. And the world agreed with that. And because of that, that was a big push in the year 2000 to launch a bigger initiative to vaccinate the world's children. And it happened as part of the Millennium Development Goals for sustainable poverty reduction. Those are the goals on 8 goals listed there in the middle. And that one with the little teddy bear was to reduce child mortality. And that's when the Gavi Alliance formed, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. And it was actually supported by $750 million from the Gates Foundation. This was the first big tranche of money that they gave us when the new Gates Foundation formed. And it's an alliance of the WHO, the World Health Organization, and UNICEF, and civil society, and the World Bank, and the pharma companies, and academic partnerships, and the Gates Foundation to see what would happen if we could really rev up and vaccinate the world's children. And the punchline is it worked. These are some information from the Global Burden of Disease study from the Institute for Health Metrics based in Seattle. And their last enumeration is in 2019. The new 2021 numbers are coming out pretty soon. But look at the impact. I mean, we went from 500,000 kids under the age of 5 dying of measles every year in 2000 to under 100,000. Now, still a lot of kids dying, but an 87% reduction. Similar effects in pertussis and tetanus and diphtheria and Haemophilus influenza type B meningitis. So no question, this was an extraordinarily successful program. And those pictures on the right, by the way, are from Sebastião Salgado, who was a Brazilian photographer who spent a year going around the world photographing kids getting their vaccinations in this spirit of exuberance. I like the pictures because of the expression on the parents' face, everything from hope to joy to fear to bewilderment. I first saw these at an exhibit at the Pan American Health Organization, but you can download most of them now. You could Google most of them. They're great pictures. And so the point is, this was an extraordinary ecosystem. And that was the idea behind going to Texas to really build a new type of vaccine enterprise that would make vaccines for these poverty-related diseases. This is a plug for our Texas Medical Center. How many people have been to it? So a couple of you. It's we do everything big in Texas, right? It's a medical city of over 100,000 employees. It's got more building space in downtown Los Angeles. It's got Baylor College of Medicine, Texas Children's Hospital, MD Anderson. It's an extraordinary undertaking. And we went there with the idea of building a tropical medicine school. And after this lecture, I'm going to be speaking in Michelle's class, right, about tropical diseases emerging in Texas and on the Gulf Coast, but also to create this vaccine center that would make vaccines that the pharma companies won't make. And so with all of that success in the Gavi Alliance, there were holes, there were gaps, and certain vaccines were not being made because there was no financial return that you could ever hope to promise. And so we started making vaccines for these diseases like schistosomiasis and hookworm and leishmaniasis and Chagas disease. And I say we, this has now been co-headed by myself and my science partner for the last 20 plus years, Dr. Mary Elena Batazzi, and trying to really pioneer not only doing interesting science, but seeing if there's a business model out there for sustainable financing that does not rely on the big pharma companies. And what was interesting is about 12 years ago, we started making coronavirus vaccines because they were orphaned as well. Nobody cared about coronavirus vaccines. So we started making vaccines for severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, that emerged out of southern China in 2002, and then Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome. And then when the COVID-19 sequence hit, we were able to turn our program around and make that. And amongst the things that we do is we do cutting edge, cool technologies like mRNA and adenovirus, but we also try to do this. We try to be directly compatible with vaccine producers in low and middle income countries. So there's about 40 of them that identify themselves as the Developing Country Vaccine Manufacturers Network, DCVMN. And they're in Asia, Africa, Latin America. And one of the most common technologies they all use is they all make their own recombinant hepatitis B vaccine, or many of them do. So which is done through microbial fermentation in yeast. It's a safe technology. It's been around a couple of decades. It's highly effective. So our thinking was, in setting up this vaccine center in Texas, if you want to be compatible and plug and play, we make the prototype using a technology that's already in place, and then they could hit the ground running and scale it up. And because countries such as Bangladesh and China and India, et cetera, are all making their own recombinant hepatitis B vaccine. And that's been our strategy whenever possible. So we've done this now for our vaccines for human hookworm infection and schistosomiasis. I won't go into too much detail about this today. I'm showing this slide to you because of the map of where hookworm and schistosomiasis occurs. And I mean, imagine if you're the CEO of a biotech, right? This is probably not the map you want in your business plan, right? Because your financial return is going to be in North America, it's going to be in Western Europe, it's going to be in Japan. What's the model by which we can get vaccines out that are occurring in what some call the global south, on the African continent, Southeast Asia, or the poorest parts of Latin America? So for instance, our schistosomiasis vaccine, this is an illness that also affects 40 million girls and women who live in extreme poverty. It's one of the most common gynecologic conditions on the African continent. It causes pain, bleeding, social stigma, depression. It often peaks in adolescence, so teenage girls get falsely accused of being sexually promiscuous because of the vaginal bleeding associated with it, when in fact they're getting it by standing in water contaminated with the larval stages of those parasites. It's also causes a 2 to 3-fold increase in acquiring HIV/AIDS. So it's an important factor in Africa's AIDS epidemic, probably because of the ulcerative lesions in the cervix, uterus, and lower genital tract. So through immunomics, Alex Lucas, who was in our group, now he's in Australia at James Cook University. He's a professor there, identified a very promising surface antigen that was very effective in mice. And then we were able to put together a funding stream to move this vaccine through production in our labs into clinical trials, and then doing a series of phase 1, phase 2 trials. I'm showing you this slide, which is ordinarily I don't like showing slides of papers, they're kind of boring to look at, but I'm showing it to remind me to tell you about the adjuvant that we use. So this is another big problem that we face, is adjuvant access. What do I mean by adjuvant access? How many people have taken the Shingrix vaccine? How'd you like it? It made you sick. It hurt, right? It hurt like hell. And the reason is because it's got 2 adjuvants, a 2 TLR agonist. It's got monophospholipid A, and their adjuvants, this is from GlaxoSmithKline, their adjuvant systems called AS01. It's got a monophospholipid A and QS21, which is a sapinin derivative. And that's what you need to really rev up an immune response against a recombinant protein, which is what Shingrix is. But guess what? We don't have access to that. So what do? So we have to kind of look and hunt around for open access versions of it. And this is a synthetic lipid A, glucopyranonyl lipid A, GLA, an aqueous formulation from an organization known as AHI, based in Seattle. They used to be called IDRI. So that's yet another problem that we face. And now we've taken this to endemic areas, Brazil, now in Africa, shown that it's safe and immunogenic. So now we're trying to move on towards phase 3 trials. And so that's exciting. We have a recombinant protein Chagas disease vaccine. And this one is a therapeutic vaccine to delay the progression of fibrosis and inflammation when the trypanosomes get into the heart. And Catherine Jones has a lot of our Chagas disease work. So we call it a therapeutic vaccine. It's like an immunotherapy for people who are failing benznidazole antiparasitic chemotherapy, because it only works in the early stages. Once the heart disease progression begins, then you start seeing a lot of fibrotic deposition, inflammation, and the studies show over a 5-year period, about 18% of people don't survive. So we're trying to see if we can improve survival with this. This is going to be done in Mexico with support from the Carlos Slim Foundation, the Kleber Foundation. And then, we get to this COVID-19 situation, which, in 2020, 2021, this is what the unvaccinated, this is a bubble map of the unvaccinated world for COVID-19. And people were not getting COVID vaccines on the African continent, India, South Asia, Southeast Asia. And we were getting frantic phone calls from ministers of health and ministers of science. Can you help us? And so what was the problem? The problem that I see was it was a science policy failure more than anything else, that there was so much emphasis on speed and so much emphasis on innovation. And we got really cool vaccines, right? mRNA and adenovirus and particle vaccines. But nobody had the situational awareness to take a step back and say, well, wait a minute, if we only rely on speed and innovation, there's, as any engineer will tell you, there's a learning curve before you can go from 0 to 14 billion doses of something. And in fact, that's what happened. There was just enough made, which were bought up by North America, by the US and Canada and Western Europe, and left out the low and middle income countries. And aside from the obvious humanitarian tragedy that ensued, it wasn't even in our own enlightened self-interest, because Delta arose out of an unvaccinated population out of India, and Omicron and its subvariants out of under-vaccinated populations on the African continent. So what we did was we hit the ground running. We made our COVID vaccine, and I'll tell you a little more about it in a minute, and then transferred it with no patents and minimizing strings attached to any low and middle income country vaccine producer who we did the due diligence, thought they could make it. We didn't want to just give it to anybody, because if they screw it up, then it tarnishes the reputation, and then it causes real problem. And India went the furthest, as Michelle pointed out, to make Corbevax. 75 million doses went into kids for their primary immunization, another 10 million adult boosters. So we provide a proof of concept that you don't have to be a big pharma company to do these kinds of things. And I think that's important. Again, not to demonize the pharma companies. They're going to do what they do, and they provide vaccines for the Gavi Alliance. But we need to build parallel mechanisms. Otherwise, we're always going to have these vaccine inequalities. Just a couple of things about Corbevax and how we did that. This is what you might see in one of our lab meetings. We had to work on, it's the receptor binding domain made through microbial fermentation in yeast, Pichia pastoris. We had to work out time for SARS and MERS to show that if you express it without the N-terminal amino acid, that's important, because that N-terminal asparagine is glycosylated, was screwing up the immune response. We had to modify a cysteine to an alanine so you don't get intermolecular disulfide bonds. Now, it may not sound like amazing science, but it took us time to work out. And that brings us to the point about this paper that we published on it. I'm not showing you this because it's the most amazing paper ever written. I'm showing it to you because it's not the most amazing paper ever written. So this kind of work is not getting published in Cell and Nature and Science. How you modify something in order to scale it up. It's published in Biochem, Biophysica, ACTA, which is fine. But the point is, by publishing it, we put every step in the production process in the open access literature. So in principle, anybody could reproduce what we're doing. The other thing it does is we're a hybrid organization in the sense we're biotech-like, we're making stuff, but we're also an academic, we're in an academic health center. So our senior scientists are also on the faculty. They need papers. So this provides them a conduit to make papers. And that's worked out fairly well. Then we do the early scale up production in our lab. And then we partner with the Emory University Non-Human Primate Center to show that it protected against virus challenge infection. The lungs looked pristine. There was no virus replication. So we knew we had a great vaccine. Unfortunately, we were not part of Operation Warp Speed because we weren't a pharma company. So the first thing that I was doing in 2020 was trying to raise money. And that was one of the advantages of being in Texas is we got support from the Kleberg Foundation and the Dunn Foundation, the MD Anderson Foundation. Tito's Vodka gave us $2 million. So Not that I'm endorsing alcohol consumption, but if should you have a vodka containing cocktail this evening, you don't want the Russian stuff anyway, right? So you would definitely want to go to Tito's. And then, anyone who's done work with Asia or on the African continent knows what that means. Is we would send the production cell bank via World Courier, and then we were on Zoom calls constantly. So, the days were starting at 4 or 5 a.m. in the morning. And at that time, I was ending my day at 10 or 11 at night with talking to Don Lemon or Lawrence O'Donnell. And so I didn't sleep for 3 years, but we got things done, and we were able to transfer it to 4 countries: India, which made Corbevax; Indonesia, Indovac; Bangladesh, which did a great job, but unfortunately their government ultimately at the 11th hour pulled the rug out from under them and decided to go buy mRNA vaccines, and in Botswana and in South Africa. And then once we transfer the technology, they own it. We don't try to hang on to it. So it's up to them to work out this concept of decolonizing the vaccine ecosystem. Everyone talks about it, but here's how I think you do it. You actually give them the ownership of it. So they work out with their own national regulatory authority how they're going to do the clinical trials, how they're going to work with the World Health Organization, how they're going to do the data sharing. And they did a great job, putting things out in the public domain in terms of publications. Not as fast as we would like, because they didn't have 1,000 people, right? So at any time they wanted to write a paper, they had to actually pull people from production in order to write the paper. And so that took time for people to understand. But they were able to show that it was highly immunogenic. It was as good. The neutralizing antibodies were as good as mRNA. They actually held up for longer than mRNA. We don't know, can't say that with 100% confidence because India doesn't have mRNA vaccines. So you can't do a head-to-head comparison in India, but the length of protection in terms of virus neutralizing antibodies is better than the adenovirus vaccines. And then they did step-down studies in kids. And by this time a year ago, this was well underway. As I mentioned, 75 million kids got this for their primary immunization. And then for Indonesia, we did the same thing. They're a big vaccine producer. So in India, it's Biological E. In Indonesia, it's Bio Farma, which is more linked with the public sector. And there we transferred a related molecule for them to produce Indovac. And what was interesting about that one is their leadership came into our labs to inspect our records, because the thing about microbial fermentation in yeast is if you do it the right way, it could be a vegan technology. You could do it without animal cells, human cells, animal proteins, human proteins. And so they were able to confirm in our documentation system that there was no animal or human source for any reagent. And then they worked with their clergy to get it certified as halal, one of the first halal COVID vaccines. So it's really interesting as things go to scale. There are things that happen that you just would never think of otherwise. So that was exciting as well. So now we're kind of looking at the world. I don't want to say that we're on the other side of COVID. I think that's probably premature. But the World Health Organization and the international health organizations are looking around and saying, okay, where do we stand now with the world's vaccines and vaccine ecosystem? And they've put this together now as the Immunization Agenda 2030. And some people are calling it the big catch-up. Why the big catch-up? Well, the big catch-up was because during with all the social disruptions because of COVID, a lot of childhood immunizations went undone. And there were gaps, there were interruptions. And not only that, is they're not coming back like the way we would have expected it to. And so the new numbers coming out of the World Health Organization are concerning. I won't read them all to you, just those 2 yellow lines, that the global coverage has dropped from 86% in 2019 to 81% in 2021. That may not sound like a big drop, but it's the first time it's gone in the wrong direction in decades. And in 2021, the number of completely unvaccinated children increased by 5 million since 2019. So the worry is that there's been a tear in the matrix, that there's been some kind of serious disruption. And here's my concern, and that's me in the monk painting over there, is that that it's not coming back, not only because of the social disruption, but something new and ominous has happened, and that there's a new rise in US and global anti-vaccine activism, and now the two are related. And we're not going to get back to baseline because all of that new generation anti-vaccine activity that expanded during COVID is now spilling over to childhood vaccination. So what I want to do is end by kind of giving you my view of the anti-vaccine empire ecosystem. Because as I say, too often it's kind of put out there as random misinformation or the infodemic, but in fact, it's got a history and it's got a progression. And so I want to end by taking you through what I call version 1.0, 2.0, 3.0 of the anti-vaccine ecosystem. And version 1.0 started around 25 years ago with false claims that vaccines cause autism. And that thread is still around, but it's not as prominent as it used to be. But about 10 years ago, it took on a political dimension under the banner of health freedom, medical freedom, and now it's globalizing. So I want to take you through 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. So let's go to 1.0 first. The original claim was vaccines cause autism, and that came out of the Wakefield paper published in The Lancet in 1998 that claimed that the measles MMR vaccine, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, the live virus in that vaccine replicated in the colon of kids and somehow caused, at that time it was called pervasive developmental disorder. Today we call it autism. And the scientific community responded in a very big way. They, did large, including the NIH, supported large cohort studies showing that kids who got the MMR vaccine were no more likely to acquire autism than kids who didn't. And similarly, kids on the autism spectrum were no more likely to have gotten the MMR vaccine compared to kids not on the autism spectrum. And that should have taken care of it. But over time, anti-vaccine groups started monetizing the internet, selling nutritional supplements, selling phony baloney autism cures, selling books on Amazon. If you go to Amazon.com right now and type in books on vaccinations, you'll see it's a horror show. It's basically all anti-vaccine COVID conspiracy books. So it's a multi-million, maybe multi-billion-dollar industry, according to the Center for Countering Digital Hate. It's amazing. We have to have something called the Center for Countering Digital Hate, right? So what happened was they weren't taking no for an answer. So they just flipped around what the false assertion was. Then it became thimerosal preservative that used to be in vaccine. And again, scientific community responded, large cohort studies, even experimental studies showing no link, thimerosal and autism. But then they switched it up again. So you got to this kind of Pyrrhic game of whack-a-mole or moving the goalpost. Every time you thought you finally debunked what they were saying, they came up with something else. So then it was spacing vaccines too close together, alum in vaccines, and then they switched it up to HPV vaccine for cervical cancer and other cancers. They said it caused infertility or autoimmunity. How many people have heard COVID-19 vaccines cause infertility or autoimmunity? Yeah, that's where they got it from. They just copy-pasted the fake assertion from HPV and onto COVID-19 vaccines. And that's how I got onto it with having Rachel and writing the book, going into a deep dive, showing there's no link between vaccines and autism, but also providing an alternative narrative, on what it is. And through the action of autism genes, some of them discovered here at Stanford, many at the Broad Institute, Harvard, MIT. We did whole exome genomic sequencing on Rachel and my wife Ann and I, and identified Rachel's autism gene, which is involved in neuronal communications. It's a neuronal cytoskeleton gene, which a lot of them are. So the point is there's an alternative narrative there. And I think that helped. I mean, I think it took some of the wind out of their sails, but by then anti-vaccine groups had gotten very powerful and they rebounded in a way which I would not have predicted. And that is through this concept of health freedom and medical freedom. And like so many trends, it started in California, but then it amplified as it only could in Texas. And so in Orange County, by 10 years ago at this time, so many kids were not getting vaccinated in Orange County, even parts of Marin County, that not surprisingly, kids were vulnerable to breakthrough infectious diseases. And measles is often the first one you see. My friend and colleague Paul Offit calls measles the canary in the coal mine. because it's so highly transmissible. As rates go down, that's the first one you see. And indeed, in 2014, 2015, there was a large measles epidemic in Orange County. And the California legislature, through some bold action, actually said, you know what, this doesn't make sense. From now on, we're going to require your kids, if they go to school, to be vaccinated. And that worked in terms of solving the measles problem. And I supported it, and I still think it was a good idea, but it also created a backlash. The backlash was this movement arose under this concept of health freedom, medical freedom, that, hey, you can't tell us to do whatever we want to do with our kids. And it got political backing in the state of Texas. So PAC money from Texas, Empower Texans, which is a Republican Tea Party PAC, started giving money to this anti-vaccine group. And that's when you first started to see this political link between the anti-vaccine movement and Republican Party politics. And it really took off in Texas. So now we're up to almost 100,000 kids not getting their complement of vaccines. And also that we have 300,000 homeschooled kids in the state of Texas. What percentage of the homeschooled kids in Texas aren't getting their vaccines? 10%? Not getting vaccines. Yeah, any? 5%? 50%? It's 80%. It's a trick question. We don't know, they're homeschooled, right? So how do you know? So the point is, we at least have 100,000, maybe a couple of 100,000 kids not getting their vaccines in the state of Texas, all because of this phony baloney health freedom, medical freedom ideology. And Texas then became a magnet for anti-vaccine activists to come down. So this is a prominent anti-vaccine activist. You can see him standing in front of the pink granite of the Texas State Capitol, and you can see he's wearing a yellow Jewish star. In some cases, they would wear it with the words "No Vax" written to look like Hebrew letters. So basically comparing vaccines to the Holocaust, misappropriating the Holocaust and really saying terrible things. All of this, then Texas became kind of the crucible for all of this. And this is what's blown up now in this time of COVID-19. This is my recent paper in the Public Library of Science called The Great Texas COVID Tragedy. And it goes something like this. So what I'm showing you on the x-axis is a timeline of 2020, 2021, 2022. And on the y-axis are the daily deaths in the state of Texas. So Texas roughly tied with California for around 100,000 deaths in each of our states. But of course, Texas is 28 million people and California is 40 million people. So Texas may be one of the worst affected states. And these are the peaks and valleys of the deaths. And the first one is the original lineage that hit Texas in the summer of 2020. The second one, the alpha wave. We'll hold off on that green arrow for a minute. And then the big Delta wave in the last half of 2021 of deaths. And then the BA1 Omicron wave. And that green arrow signifies May 1, 2021. That's the date that the Biden administration announced. Anybody want to get a COVID vaccine, get a COVID vaccine. They were widely and freely available. And so all of the deaths happening after the green arrow are pretty much those who refused to take a COVID vaccine. They needlessly perished because they didn't take a COVID vaccine, when these vaccines are more than 91% protective versus death or serious illness during that Delta wave. So as Delta swept through Texas, particularly in the conservative parts of East Texas, the Panhandle, Central Texas, the loss of life was just massive and unnecessary. So when if I gave grand rounds at University of Texas Tyler in East Texas, everyone's lost a loved one, because everyone you talk to has lost a loved one because they refused a COVID vaccine. And that was Texas. So 40,000 needless deaths, almost half the deaths were needless. And this is what's happening nationally. Around 200,000 Americans needlessly lost because they refused a COVID vaccine, mostly in the southern states, Texas and other southern states, some of the Rocky Mountain states. And now we're starting to understand why. And there are several analyses that are out there. A lot of them led by Charles Gaba, who's a health analyst, but it's been reproduced by the New York Times, National Public Radio, the Pew Research Center. And it goes something like this. If you look at that wave on the right, What I'm showing you is by a partisan divide. It's basically showing red is Republican, blue is Democrat, blue liberal, conservative, or whatever term you want to use. And it basically shows that the redder the county, the lower the immunization rate and the higher the death rate. So much so that the New York Times just simply, David Leonhardt of the New York Times just simply calls it red COVID. Here's some other information. This is also from New York Times and Charles Gaba, showing you the difference using Trump voters as kind of a surrogate measurement of Republicans versus Democrats. You can see on the left that during the Delta wave, the deaths overwhelmingly in the heavily red counties versus the blue counties. On the right is another analysis from Charles Gaba. On the x-axis there is percent Trump voters as a surrogate, and on the y-axis is the percentage of the population that was vaccinated against COVID. I mean, the R coefficient is just off the charts. And so the question that we could talk about the Q&A is, how the heck do we talk about this, right? Because all of our training as physicians and scientists said, you're not really supposed to talk about Republicans and Democrats or liberals or conservatives. We're supposed to be politically neutral, right? But what do you do when the deaths are occurring so massively, against one group? And the way I say it is, they're victims. These people that you meet in East Texas and elsewhere are, would give you the shirts off their back. They would, if you were stuck on the side of the road, I'd much rather be in East with a flat tire. I'd much rather be in East Texas than in Palo Alto, right? I mean, people will be rushing in East Texas to be the first to help you change your tire, right? And they were victims. What were they victims of? They were victims of the House Freedom Caucus, right? They were victims because that was the language at the CPAC conference in Dallas in 2021. First they're going to vaccinate you, then they're going to take away your guns and Bibles, quote unquote. As ridiculous as that sounds to us, that was widely accepted where I am in Texas. Or members of the rhetoric of the House Freedom Caucus, Marjorie Taylor Greene, calling people like myself medical brown shirts, using Nazi paramilitary analogies, because that's what vaccines are. They're used by Nazis, right? And Senator Johnson of Wisconsin, right, who held public roundtables for the vaccine injured, right, all during the Delta wave. And then this was now documented by two groups. Media Matters is a watchdog group, as well as ETH Zurich, the Federal University of Technology in Zurich, the law school, did an analysis of Fox News and all other broadcasts. And every night on Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham, during that Delta wave, the content was filled with anti-vaccine content, either falsely disparaging the effectiveness of vaccines or the safety of vaccines, and then piled on by the talking heads that went on Fox News. The point, it was organized, and it was well financed, and it was politically motivated. And when you look at societal forces of death, it's up there with everything else: suicide, road traffic accidents, gun violence, anti-science activism, although we don't usually frame it that way, has become a major lethal force. And then there are side stories to this. There's a lot of anti-Semitism with it as well. For me, I'm the trifecta, because not only am I a vaccine scientist, but I'm a Jewish vaccine scientist. And of course, I also created the COVID virus too. So and I've been writing about some of the threats and having to get the various police departments involved, et cetera. So this is my last slide, and then we can chat a bit. This is my new book coming out. It's called The Deadly Rise of Anti-Science, a Scientist's Warning. That really kind of does a deep dive explaining all of these aspects, and also how you have a discussion about it, because it's such an unpleasant area to talk to. And it takes us out of our comfort zone, having to talk about politics. In fact, in the book, I talk quite a bit with political scientists like Ruth Ben-Gad or the writings of Anne Applebaum, because that's the only way to really understand it, I think. And I think this is one of the reasons why the health sector doesn't know what to do, because it's become first and foremost a political movement. So when you It's just weird to hear it. So when you look at what the response has been, it's kind of skirting around the edges at the periphery. So the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, is an excellent Surgeon General. What does he do? He talks about meeting with the heads of the social media companies to make sure things don't go viral, right? So talking to the heads of Facebook or Meta, wherever it's called, Twitter. And of course, that's useful, but it doesn't get to those generating the content. Or you have the pro-vaccine groups trying to put out positive pro-vaccine messages, all helpful, but I think it's only a small piece of it. So I met with Dr. Tedros last year at the WHO in Geneva and basically said, this thing is now going across the world. So that same US style anti-vaccine activism is now going up into Canada with the Health Freedom Convoy. You see it in Central Europe, you see it in Germany and Austria, where it's linked to far-right extremist groups, and that same US style. And now it's on the African continent. Now it's in South Asia. So you're starting to see that same US style rhetoric now interfering with uptake of the malaria vaccine, for instance. It makes absolutely no sense, but that's the reality. So my worry is now that this is going to have an impact on our ability to vaccinate the world's kids and could even reverse global goals. So that's another part of the warning as well. So let me stop there and see what people think, and thank you so much.
Just a call for all, there's a lot of people online. For those of you online, please do put in questions. I'll get to them here. And please do vote, just like we usually do when we're only online, vote questions too, so I know which ones to answer. Anybody would like to start off here? Great.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hotez. That was amazing. And, I think all of us probably have been following you for a long time and are so grateful for the work that you're doing. One question that I'd love to hear your thoughts on is, it seems in general, when there's misinformation or disinformation, responding with facts does not seem to change people's minds. And I think as physicians and scientists, that's what we're trained to do, right? Here's a paper that shows this, or here's what the data show on that. But that doesn't change opinions. And so what do you think are the most effective strategies for fighting misinformation?
Yeah, that's the hardest question I get asked, and also the most frequent question I get asked. And it used to work, right? And pre-COVID, right? If a parent wasn't vaccinating their kids, you could have a discussion and really sit down, explain, why measles and pertussis are killer diseases, why they could easily come back. And most of the time, parents would vaccinate their kids. Now, what you're seeing is people are tying their political identities to not accepting vaccines. It's become part of the canon, right? That the election was stolen, Putin over Zelensky, and we're not taking those vaccines, especially mRNA vaccines. And so the question then becomes, how do you uncouple it, right? I mean, I don't care about your conservative views, even your extreme conservative views. I'm not going there with you. I mean, fine, you want to believe whatever, that's your business. But somehow we have to uncouple the anti-science stuff, because that's killing too many Americans. And how you do that, what I've said to the Biden administration is, I'm not sure the health sector really knows anymore. And that's why I bring in people from Homeland Security, from the Justice Department, the Commerce Department. You also have state actors like the Russians who are using this as a wedge issue. And so they're actually filling our bots and filling our internet with bots and trolls that are both anti-vaccine and pro-vaccine, because they're just looking at what's out there that's a divisive issue in the country, and because they just want to destabilize democracy. So bringing a State Department also, could be extremely helpful. So I just gave you one of the longer I don't know answers, but those are the kinds of, and I said basically the same thing to Tedros. I said, I'm not sure WHO really knows what to do, but bring in some of the other UN agencies, bring in NATO, because it's as a killing force, it's up there with anything else at this point.
Thank you so much for this talk. The work you're doing, especially to globalize vaccine production delivery, is remarkable, and then also your commentary about the anti-vax movement. On the anti-vaccine thing, one thing that I wrestle with a lot is, I don't know how much this will, change things because of the moving goalposts and a lot of things, but I think that sometimes we as a medical community, we end up accepting, our response to the anti-vaccine movement is to accept less high quality data to support our arguments as well. And we take more confounded studies. We ignore our equipoise in conducting high quality clinical trials. And this has happened in my field of oncology with other things, but it's also happening now, I feel like, to some degree with vaccine production. And I don't know if you have any comments about what is, is that an appropriate response, or are we sort of falling into this trap and further in this mission?
Well, here's one of the problems. So, early on in the pandemic, like a lot of people, I wrote a couple articles about the major talking points that people were using why they weren't getting mRNA vaccines. And they ranged from the seemingly plausible to the total wackadoodle, right? So seemingly plausible, vaccines were rushed. How can they be legit? And you can explain to them, no, these vaccines were being developed over 10 years, et cetera, all the way to, they'll magnetize me. And you had the person at the Ohio legislature stand up there and start sticking keys and bobby pins on her forehead to show she was magnetized, and total theater of the absurd. Of course, they fell right off. And but you could go through those talking points and debunk them all. But at the end of the day, they still weren't going to take those vaccines. And I think it's because in a large share just had their identity, and I don't know how else to say it, their identity and political allegiance tied to not getting a vaccine, even though they didn't want to articulate it that way. That was really the underlying basis. So I think it is important to provide information, high quality information. And occasionally I do that if I can debunk something that's obvious, but less and less is it effective also.
If I could jump to virtual, we're getting a lot of questions here as well, and I'll come back to the room. Dr. Nan asks, she first says, thank you for all your work. Could you comment on the duration of vaccine efficacy versus effectiveness and the message around the need for boosters as potentially contributing fodder to the anti-vax movement?
Yeah, I mean, this is really Mother Nature threw us a curveball when she started putting up all the Omicron variants and started requiring boosters. It looks like our protein technology may hold up even a little better than mRNA, which is really interesting. But the point is, trying to explain that is the reality. I think when the vaccines were rolled out, as if you remember, 2 immunizations 3 to 4 weeks apart for Pfizer and Moderna, I was one of the first to say, by the way, we're probably going to need a booster because if you look at most childhood immunizations, what do? You give a series of primary immunizations, you wait 6 months to a year, and then you boost. And that's how vaccines protect for years and years. And so I said, it's not going to be 1 and done, 2 and done, but it could be 3 and done. So for a while there, I was looking really good, during the all the way into Delta and the BA1. And then you started to see that pretty rapid declining of effectiveness of mRNA, which I think is a combination of the fact that, one, you're getting these new immune escape variants, but also I think the mRNA technology may not be holding up as well as we thought for reasons that I don't entirely understand. So I think the point is, I think you have to say those things. And I think one of the problems that I saw with Health and Human Services agencies communication is they use this kind of old school communication that somebody told them that they have to talk to the American people like they're in the 4th grade or the 6th grade. And I found that didn't work. And at least it didn't work for my style. I would go into a fair bit of complexity and give my underlying assumptions so that people could help people understand. I think too often the Health and Human Services agency just gave summary conclusions. Say, we say this without really backing it up. And then it rang hollow when things didn't go as well later on. Plus, just the way the mechanism of communicating, where they're sitting there like in little boxes, like in the Hollywood squares, but those austere blue backgrounds, like it was like Kim Jong-un would do, and that didn't help either. So how they did the communications, I think, was seriously flawed. It's better now, but there's still a lot of work. But I think the message was they felt that they needed to simplify. And I think, the key is not to speak and use a lot of jargon, but to talk to people like they're adults, talk to people, like you really care about them, and go into some level of complexity. And then they would say, well, look, we're trying to reach all parts of the country. What they're really saying was, the truth was you had 2/3 of the country was all in, right? Hey, doc, just tell me what I got to do to keep my family safe. And then another quarter or a third of the country was down that Fox News rabbit hole. And no matter what you said, that you weren't going to be listening anyway. And I think, in fairness to them, they wanted to amortize that and create a single message for the whole nation. I don't think that was doable under those circumstances either.
To pick up on that point, it seems like in addition to anti-vax, what you have really is an epidemic of inability to evaluate information, so that just putting information out there is not good enough. So what would you think about, for instance, putting a whole institute to fight the pandemic of inability to evaluate information?
Yeah, when you looked at, and I think there, and given the death toll that it caused, and by the way, it's not just deaths, we know long COVID can occur after any COVID infection, but it's statistically more likely after severe COVID. So think of all the long COVID that's going to affect the southern states now, and this is going to haunt us for a long time. Clearly part of the answer is we need better dialogue with our social scientist colleagues, and I think that kind of institute, would be helpful to bring the biomedical scientists and the social scientists together. I also am sort of troubled by some of the data coming from the Kaiser Family Foundation on those who did refuse a vaccine. So it tended to be younger Republicans, not your Jim Baker, George H.W. Bush Republicans, more rural than urban, and tend to have lower educational attainment as well. So they really were victims of this disinformation juggernaut. So I think it's really important how we frame disinformation, to recognize that it is organized, it's deliberate, just like any other lethal societal force.
Dr. Hotez, we have a few different questions online here that if I can't, we have so many questions, can't get to them all, but I might just draw us on a similar theme, of course, of anti-vaxxers. I might just mention a few of them to get your thoughts. Thomas Burns says, how do you counter the anti-vaxxers' freedom of speech on social apps? David Sachs, perhaps the anti-vaxxers will self-immolate themselves. Please comment. Kenneth Weinberg, nice talk. Thank you. U.S. has a unique long history of patent medicines, nutritional supplements, instead of just eating a balanced diet, et cetera, that the anti-vax movers build upon. Why do you think that anti-vaxxers have gained international traction? And then Edward Lebowitz, isn't this just another manifestation of anti-intellectualism? The mere fact that smart, quote unquote, smart people say something is true is reason enough to disdain it, whether it is or not. And then Donna Williams.
Sounds like you got the topic list for a whole course, right?
Donna Williams, we were handicapped by lack of data. I don't, quote unquote, I don't know is not compelling, but we have a body of evidence now. So there's lots of questions like that. Any vaccine, just general thoughts.
Yeah, this does get up to a lot of freedom of speech issues, and it gets very complicated very quickly. And you see it on Twitter, right? Since Elon came back and brought back all of the prominent anti-vaccine activists, Twitter is just a minefield now. It was never great to begin with, but now it's just, it's just awful as a platform. What do you do about that when it's killing Americans? And that's where I always come back to. This is not some kind of theoretical academic discussion. Lives have been lost, and now that it's contaminating things globally, this is going to do a lot of irreparable harm. So trying to understand it at greater levels. I think one of the findings in the book is that it's very much linked to authoritarian far-right politics. So you're saying, is it unique to the United States? Well, you're seeing some of it in Orbán's Hungary. You're seeing it in, if Bolsonaro had gotten reelected, you saw it in Bolsonaro's Brazil. as well. And is there historical precedent for that? And in the book, I go into what Stalin did during the 30s and 40s, which was, to see scientists as enemies of the state and to disparage Mendelian genetics and throw Vavilov in the gulag to promote Lysenko, who, even though his Lamarckian theories killed 2 to 3 million Ukrainian peasants, it was all about authoritarian control. So this idea that it's not only targeting the science, but it's targeting the scientists, that also worries me. The climate scientists have been dealing this now for a few years, but now they're going after the biomedical scientists. And I think there we need a greater voice coming out of the national academies. So we're not getting that really strong support from the national academies or from the scientific societies, in part because of this commitment to political neutrality. And so it becomes very complicated. They're, by their charters, they're supposed to be politically neutral. So what do you do when deaths are coming because of a partisan divide? And I don't think anybody has a roadmap for how to manage that.
Dr. Hotez, before we close up, I want to ask Dr. Berry to come up and actually close us out today. But again, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much.
It's such an honor to have you here.
By the way, you can always email me. As I like to say, the anti-vaxxers have my email, so you can have it too. So it's just Hotez, last name at BCM, stands for Baylor College of Medicine.edu. But just put in the subject line, you're part of this, because you can imagine what my inbox looks like. So.
I'm going to be very brief because we're over, but I just wanted to thank you, Peter, as usual.
Thank you.
You gave a masterful grand rounds, but I really want to thank you for all of your advocacy for public health at great personal risk. So be strong. We're with you.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. So great to be here.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.